Hi, everyone. This is Paige Garvin from Jennifer Schaus and Associates. Thank you for joining us in a sponsored content webinar. Our webinar is brought to you today by ELINT Capital. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent out within 24 hours. You can also find our 800 plus government contracting videos on our YouTube channel. They are all complimentary. And lastly, please post any questions in the question box in your control panel and not in the chat box. Welcome to part one of ELINT's three-part series, Winning and Growing in GovCon. Today's session is called How to Read a Contract Before You Bid It. We'll cover the cash and risk signals hiding in plain sight in a solicitation before you ever submit a proposal. With that, I'll throw it over to Madison Erlacher, Director of Marketing for ELINT Capital.
Hi, everyone. We are so excited to introduce to you John Shoraka and Christopher Cox, our guest speakers on today's webinar. We are ELINT Capital. Our company was created to help contractors win and grow in their government contracting. So if you'd like to hear more about our history, we have done other videos on that, but we do want to move on and be able to get into this webinar. So you can check our YouTube if you want to see that. I am going to go ahead and pass it over to John Shoraka and Christopher Cox to introduce themselves and give a little bit of their background, and then we will get into the subject.
Thank you. Thanks, Madison. Thank you guys for having us here today. Maybe if we can go to the next slide. Just real quick, and I think obviously focusing on the topic is the important thing today. And one step back, I think if we can keep it as conversational as possible. I think folks have an ability to put questions into the chat. If you have any questions, Chris and I love to sort of engage the audience, have a discussion on any of the topics that we're talking about, and it keeps it more entertaining rather than having you guys listen to us for this time period. But I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank ELINT for having us here in Madison. And real quick, Chris can certainly speak for himself, but he has over a decade of experience as a contracting officer, both at the U.S. Marine Corps as well as the EPA. He's done an incredible job supporting our clients at GCP with respect to contract admin, contract performance issues, pre-award, post-award, proposal prep process, etc. My background as chairman of Gov Contract Pros, I actually used to run the small business set-aside programs at the Small Business Administration under President Obama. Did that for about a period of 7 years. Before that, I did government contracting. Post that, we've provided advisory services for small business government contractors. Chris, did I miss anything on that, or your background or the services sort of you support our clients with?
No, that was comprehensive. Yeah, just to reiterate, decade of experience in the acquisition field on the federal government side. Got the WEA level 3 contract certifications, professional contract certifications, FACC certifications. So well versed in the government acquisition field and looking forward to help.
Awesome. Thank you. Can we go to the next slide? So I think overall, as you look at this particular session, and I know it's 1 out of 3 sessions, I think from sort of a high level, as we look at what's the topics of discussion today, I think overall, when I look at it is, and Chris, you and I were talking about this, is just how do you read the solicitation and what do you focus on? What are the main points that you should be focusing on? If you're new to this, how do you develop the skills to become better at it over time? But especially if you're new to this, how do you prevent any significant detrimental potential reactions with respect to not knowing what you're doing, right? And quite frankly, I guess to a certain degree, what are the risks that you face as you're sort of responding to a solicitation? Obviously, I think there's different topics we'll cover today. They're on the screen. But overall, that's sort of how I picture this, right? You're looking at a solicitation. What should you be focusing on? Where do the risks lie? And then sort of how do you hone your skills over a period of time to become better at that? Is that how you see it, Chris, or is there any specific issues that you would more focus on?
Yes, I agree. So when you look over the solicitation, everything that's going to be in the contract is found there. The government shows you exactly what they're soliciting, the requirements, how they're going to pay, the structure, everything. And then it's just finding, any vague issues in there or any questions that you may have and moving forward through there. But everything is in there. We just got to learn how to read it and know what we're looking for.
Yeah, and I think if you look at this list, right, I think from my perspective, one of the things is the PWS or the work statement, right? In having been both inside government and outside government, I've seen some with with a high degree of specificity, which I think to a certain degree is good, but sometimes maybe not because it doesn't allow flexibility where potentially needed. And then I see some that are so vague that raise concerns from my perspective because then you don't know like what is success, right? Or what actually is a deliverable, or what's adequate performance or excellent performance. So before we get to the next slide, which I think is the PWS slide, what are your thoughts on that? Like just a high level sort of degree of specificity versus being more vague with respect to creating some flexibilities as you learn things once you dive into a project. Any thoughts on that, Chris?
Yes. So with the specificity, I think it can depend on what the solicitation's for, whether it's services and whether it's highly defined or what the background there is. Ideally, there's some sort of minimum and threshold, and then a higher level that you need to reach. Those thresholds and requirements are very well defined. I've seen plenty of those. They're very nice, easy to follow as a contractor. Hey, like this is your clear threshold to meet, but we're reaching for here. So those are nice. When they're vague, it's just a generic statement. There's no tied. It's not tied to a deliverable. It's not tied to a specification. It's not tied to anything. Those can be difficult to perform. And then if the government pings you on it and hey, they're going to lean towards their understanding, the statement of work's a little vague. So it's a situation we don't really want to be in. It's a lot of he said, she said, they did this, we did this. And those kind of can fall into disputes and different things we want to stay out of. So getting a PWS that's a little bit more specified, asking questions, get rid of vague is very useful on the front end before you're halfway through a contract and find out that's an issue.
Right. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so I think this is sort of what we were talking about. Obviously, I think there are a good number of things in a solicitation that as a contractor, you would want to focus on, right? In addition to these, right? I think we're pointing out a number of things that potentially have significant risks. I mean, you and I know, and I think probably a lot of the folks on this call know, that there are multiple sections in a solicitation that require our attention, including the sections that describe what your proposal should include and the qualification criteria, grading criteria, et cetera. But I think from a high level with respect to sort of where are the potential risks and where do I potentially run into issues with the government? And quite frankly, from a contractor standpoint, where is my profit margins and where are I possibly losing money or have the potential for losing money? I think these are some of the areas to focus on, right? And I think we sort of touched on the PWS. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the CLIN structure, because a contract can have multiple CLINs. I know there's a slide specifically on that, but sort of high level, if someone doesn't know what a CLIN structure is, why are there CLINs and why do they categorize them? And I'll talk a little bit about the payment terms to talk about, what you should be aware of as far as payment terms in the time period between starting work and actually getting paid.
Yeah, so at a high level, the CLIN structure is basically defined tasks or deliverables or products that are linked to the payment structure. So a lot of times, some contracts can be very broken out, where you have 7 CLINs, each one to a task. Other ones can be 2 CLINs, and it's kind of mashes all the tasks together. But regardless, that directly ties into your payment structure, how you're getting paid, when you get paid, and what you have to do to get paid. But that's at a high level. It's just your overall structure of the contract, your tasks, and different things like what delivery, period performance, firm fixed price, cost, and all those different details that lead towards both performance and payment.
So, and I actually apologize because there might be folks that don't necessarily know this. And I know when we work on this all the time, we take these acronyms for granted, right? And tell me if I get this wrong, because over time, I used to run some of these programs, right? But you lose track of them. A contract line item number, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So, and just what you explained, right? It's not a standard way of creating those line items, right? Sometimes it's per delivery. Sometimes it's the fixed costs broken out of the time and material costs. It's sort of like on a solicitation by solicitation basis, you have to focus on it and see what each CLIN includes, right?
Yes, that's correct. And some are priced, some are non. You'll find these what they call non-separately priced, which then you roll up the pricing for that kind of gets rolled up into the other CLINs in your pricing structure. So it's not standard from solicitation to solicitation. It's kind of unique based on this what tasks are or the services or deliverables. And then it's also based on the contracting office too. Some are very more, or some break it out a lot more, and then others like to group it into a single task or a single CLIN. And so there's good and bad to both situations, but it's just something that needs to be paid attention to.
Okay. And I think the last one, at least from my perspective, when you talk about payment terms, and again, there's slides on these and we'll delve a little bit deeper into them. I think when you talk about payment terms, one of the things, at least sitting on the other side of the table as a government contractor, and more so for new entrants, the idea of, you have to mobilize, and sometimes there might be a mobilization payment associated with a particular contract. But as a contractor, you have to be able to mobilize, field your staff, or start delivery before you really get significant payment from the government, right? So you have to actually strategize that ahead of time. Smaller businesses oftentimes have a much more difficulty with that, which is cash flow, et cetera. And then I know, obviously, even under the Obama administration, under the Biden administration, I would argue even under Trump 1, there was sort of the quick pay with respect to small business government contractors. And I don't know if you sort of saw that from your side as a contracting officer and the impact of that. But I think overall, sort of high level payment terms are sometimes an issue for small business government contractors because they can't carry, 30, 60, 90 days of project mobilization before getting paid. What are your thoughts on that? And do you have any particular sort of perspective on quick pay and maybe from the government side?
Yeah, so it was always a high level of emphasis, especially at the Marine Corps when I worked there. Whenever we did small business contracting, to make sure that payments were being processed, invoices were being processed, those type of things were being done. We paid special attention to the actual CLIN structure itself, whether that was doing an upfront firm fixed price CLIN to allow for some cash flow for the project until the next milestone. Different things like that. There's progress payments. The FAR allows for progress payments for small businesses and different things like that. So there are some elements and tools between the contractor and the government to allow for some flexibility with financing and for payments. So that's an option. That's something else to look for in the solicitation, whether those clauses are included, and then also at a possible question and answer situation to ask for that if that's an option under the contract.
Awesome. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great. So when you talk about sort of, and we've touched on some of this, right? But I think if you look at it sort of at some of the things, and you even pointed out other things that might not even be on this list with respect to the work statement, right? Some of the things that I think we've touched on, vagueness versus specificity, right? I mean, if there is a lot of vagueness with respect to what is the service, what is the deliverable, how much flexibility do you have in the way that you deliver it, that creates an interpretation issue between what you might think is the interpretation of the PWS as opposed to what the government might think. So the less vagueness, maybe the better. And to a large extent, when there is vagueness, that risk is transferred to you because ultimately, and this is a good question for you, Chris, as putting on your KO or contracting officer hat, ultimately, if the government doesn't feel that you delivered based on their understanding, you're at fault because they're not agreeing to what you delivered. I mean, there's all sorts of mechanisms to object to that, but that's basically how it works, right?
Yeah, that's correct. The government, they based on the contractor performance deems whether it's under the contract term. So you can get hit with cure notices, and then all the way to the end of termination for default in the worst case scenario. So, and as a past performance issue, that can be pretty detrimental. So,
yeah,
yes.
that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really good point. And this is not necessarily on here. And I like that we're digressing a little bit because I think you make an important point with respect to past performance. And so not only is this potentially a risk with respect to performance on this contract, right? But the consequence of potentially getting into trouble on this particular requirement after you win it doesn't end with even challenges on this contract. It follows you based on your past performance references. And how does it, I mean, as a KO, how does that impact a potential vendor that's now looking for future opportunities?
So past performance is part of your evaluation of any awardee. So at the time of proposals, you'll check it, and then at the time of making awards, you'll check it, and that's within CPARs. So there's different rankings based on how you did, and that based on the previous contract that the government has put in there. So we, as a contracting officer, you have to check that, verify that, and if there's poor ratings, you either have to justify it and get approval for it, or it can be the deciding factor between two awardees.
Okay, so that's even another risk, right? So not only on this current contract do you run the risk of issues with not having a clear understanding of what your deliverables are, but if you don't understand it here and it gets you in trouble, it can follow you around for a good while of time and potentially harm future business. I think some of the other issues on here, from my perspective, having been a contractor to the federal government, one thing that pops out at me, and I'm wondering sort of what sticks out at you, Chris, from your perspective. Two things that pop out at me. One is misunderstanding around the government-furnished property, right? Am I going to get office space? Do I have to lease office space? Am I going to get computers? Do I get desks? All those things. If I have to be on site, what does that include? What do I have to bring myself? Oftentimes there isn't clarity in that. Then you show up and you're like, oh, well, I didn't price that in. And then it's not just like I didn't price that in. It's like, well, you should have known. You can't just, then there's an entire process to be able to justify why you didn't know and maybe get your contract increased, but maybe not. So that to me is an issue. And then the other thing that really pops out at me is, which oftentimes a contractor, at least smaller businesses, because they feel they can't challenge, is period of performance. Like, you establish a period of performance, you look at it, you're like, well, I have to comply with that. I'm not going to even question it. I have to comply with that. But as a subject matter expert delivering on a government requirement, oftentimes your perspective and your feedback with respect to period of performance, or at least understanding the risks that come with accepting that period of performance, become really important. So do you have any thoughts on those two things, or are there other things on this slide that sort of stick out to you with respect to the PWS?
Yeah, I would say, as you mentioned, don't make an assumption on GFE or GFP. It should be stated in there. It should be very specific. You know, who you need to go to, who issues it, how much, or what's being issued. Even down to how you maintain or control it, the return process, different things like that. So that should all be included in the solicitation, in the contract. And then as far as past performance, yeah, it is important to perform adequately, because that is something that follows you around. I know we would always check a minimum of 3 years in the past, up to 5 years. So it's not something that goes away very quickly. And then I will mention, just for anybody who maybe hasn't had a contract yet and you're thinking about past performance, like, oh, I don't have any, the FAR does have requirements for evaluation that if there is no past performance, that it's rated neutrally. Like, it doesn't hurt you not having past performance. So I just kind of wanted to mention that for anybody who may be new to the field.
Yeah.
What's up?
Okay.
I'm on a webinar. Hold on.
So any questions so far, Madison?
Actually, we just got one, and it is, if GFE or GFP isn't guaranteed in writing, how much would someone actually budget as a buffer, or how can you push back on that and get it in writing?
So from my perspective, and Chris, I'm sure you have your perspective from your side of the fence. From my perspective, this is a great opportunity to specifically ask questions during the Q&A.
Let's get out of here, guys. Out.
Oh, actually, someone might be not on mute, but so the one thing that I'd say is the Q&A is really important with respect to asking questions to that extent. The other thing that I'd say is it entirely depends what kind of work it is, right? Is it on-site work? Is it off-site work? Is it a deliverable or a product? Is it a service? So it's very specific to a particular statement of work and type of work. But it's a great opportunity to follow up with a contracting officer if there's any either misunderstanding or vagueness around this. But Chris, from your perspective, I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
I would just reiterate that most solicitations, I would say, I guess I can't speak it to universally, but most solicitations have a Q&A or a question and answer period, whether that's 2 weeks or a month, depending on how long the solicitation's out there. And this gives contractors and industry the ability to go back and, whether that's the PWS, whether that's anything in the solicitation that may have some questions or vagueness, and GFP, GFE is a perfect example of that. If it reads as though you should be getting that and there's no language regarding that, bring that up. And then the government will provide clarification whether, hey, contractors on the hook for the equipment, or the government will be providing, and the language is going to be added to the solicitation. So that'll give great clarity there, and not just those two issues, but anything that you may have an issue or clarification or vagueness, and the government will provide an answer.
And I guess from my high level on this, Chris, my takeaway is know what it means to be successful, right? And make sure that the government agrees with you. So at the end of the day, if you want to deliver, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the delivery, right? What is expected? What is considered success? And do you and the government agree, and are you on the same page? Is there anything you would add to that, I guess?
Yeah, a successful performance is ultimately the goal. The four corners of the contract and the solicitation itself determine that. So what the deliverables are, those, and what the achievable goals are, all that should be like stated very specifically in the solicitation, in the contract, and allow for successful performance from both the government side and the contractor side. So that's the ultimate goal. The government wants the contractor to be successful. The contractor wants to perform for the government. So it's just trying to have that, mutual beneficial relationship to get the work done and to be partners in the future.
And that's a good point. And I know we're spending a lot of time on this one slide, but that's a good point. It's a partnership, right? A lot of times contractors, especially small business contractors, run into or have the perception that the relationship is confrontational. And sometimes it becomes that, but it really is a partnership, right? Because it's a partnership with the government and your contracting officer to get the program office the product or service that they need, right? And you're working together to get that done effectively, efficiently, to the customer's satisfaction. Is that agree? You agree with that?
Yes, I agree. Yeah,
Okay.
That's the end goal. That's the point, or that's the purpose. And the majority are in that. Yes, sometimes it can be confrontational and when issues arise, but to try to prevent that is kind of just finding what's vague, what may be potential issues by reading the solicitation, and moving forward and starting off on the right foot.
Awesome. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this was the CLINs that we were talking about, right? And this is just an example of it. And as you had mentioned, Chris, before, there is no standard way of splitting out CLINs. In this particular example, it's just giving examples of firm fixed price versus time and material. There's option years and escalations that you should be concerned about. What are your initial thoughts on this? I mean, if I look at this, firm fixed price, at least when I was on the other side of the fence, firm fixed price to me always was a good idea, but you take on risk. The contractor takes on the risk, right? To me, it's a good idea because if you can think you can do it efficiently, you price it out, you try and be as efficient as possible, you make the delivery, you make up that difference or that profitability by being more efficient, but yet the government gets what they wanted and everybody's happy. But at the same time, firm fixed price, things shift, things change. You still have to deliver at the same price. So to me, that has a potential sort of risk associated with it. What are your thoughts as far as like, how does the government look at it? And in what situations does the government sort of implement the firm fixed price model?
Yeah, so exactly to what you said, the firm fixed price, the risk is more on the contractor side. Government prefers firm fixed price, especially recently. There was an executive order pushing for firm fixed price contracts. So that's the preference, and it does push it to the contractor side, mainly for underestimating certain costs or different things like that. After contract award, that's the price. That's what you're going to get paid, unless contractor or the government directs different contractor or different scope changes or different things like that. There are some REAs and different ways to change costs of the contract, but if nothing changes in the scope or the requirements, what the price was is the price at once it's awarded. So firm fixed price, it's pretty strict there. The government traditionally tries to go firm fixed price when it's very when the requirement's known, when you know the outcomes or what needs to be done. If it's even the government isn't really sure of what the performance of the contract's going to be, sometimes that leans towards cost reimbursement, because that will protect the contractor. So you propose a price, but hey, if the actual costs overrun a little bit because there was a little bit unsure, then you get reimbursed for that. So those are kind of the overview of the differences between cost and firm fixed price. But yeah, so firm fixed price definitely can be a good thing if you price well and you know how to do it. But you can run the risk if you are overly optimistic, I would say, on the performance. Yeah.
And so for one of the things that oftentimes people lose track of, when we talk about time and material or even cost reimbursable, right? There's ceilings associated with that too, right? So even though it is cost reimbursable, you have to be aware of the imposed ceilings that you have. I mean, if it doubles in price, you're not necessarily going to be able to charge the double in price. So you have to be aware of the ceilings and the margins associated with that. And then as far as sort of the mechanics or the systems that a contractor has to have in place to monitor and bill the government in those instances, it becomes more complex as well, right? Because you expect on the government side a breakdown of all that, right? So if it's time and material, you're going to have your time, your rates, all the buildup for the time and material, the specific reimbursables, the margins on those. So the mechanics and compliance with respect to billing then becomes exponentially, potentially more complex.
Yes, that's correct. The cost side, there's a lot more supporting documentation that needs to be provided on the invoice level, cost elements, different things like that. Where on the beneficial side of firm fixed price is the government doesn't require that kind of level of detail. It's if you submit your invoice for that CLIN at that price and they pay you out, assuming successful performance. So it's way less burdensome on the data driven aspect when it's firm fixed price.
Yeah, and one thing on here at least that pops out to me, and then I'm going to see what major issues, if we haven't discussed them yet, that you'd want to point out. One thing that often happens, and small businesses, especially when they get their first award or their second or third large award, sometimes don't focus on it, is option years and price escalations, right? So they're really happy they got it. They're not necessarily looking down to the years or ahead to the option year, but that can actually come back to hurt you significantly, right? Because not only is there significant unknown between today and maybe next year or 5 years down the road, inflation, et cetera. So you're committing to that if you're pricing out your option years. You're committing to deliver so many years in the future at the prices that you've priced out in your proposal for the option year. So from my perspective, that definitely needs to be something to consider. And nobody has, the future, magic ball to look into the future, but it's really important to at least think about and price that appropriately. And look, so I guess from the opposite side, if you price it low, your price proposal is going to come up, higher. So you're taking that risk by pricing it low to be more competitive, but it has ramifications and risk. So any comments on that, and then anything else on this slide, I think, Chris, that you think we want to cover?
Yeah, just to reiterate that as well, those option firm fixed price, if the government follows the option clauses correctly, they can unilaterally exercise those. So you're on the hook for those. So if they're underpriced or if inflation or escalation wasn't included, that can become an issue later on. I will say, as John just mentioned, when it comes to rating your price, that's also an important thing to read in the solicitation is section L&M. They have the instructions and evaluation. And in there, it will tell you the evaluation factors and how they're evaluated. So a lot of times, if it is a trade-off or best value, price is like third or fourth. So it's usually the technical side, the expertise side that is heavily weighted. So that's just something to consider as well. Don't just underbidding sometimes even it doesn't lead to as beneficial of a rating as you might believe. So that's another aspect to read in the solicitation on how it will be evaluated.
Awesome. Anything else, Madison? Any questions so far?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it came in on this slide or at the very end of the last slide, but
Okay.
it says, you spoke that if you don't have past performance, it won't hurt you. Is that across the board, or is there some limitation to that statement? And is it based on RFO?
So from my perspective, and I'll let Chris answer this because he pointed that out. From my perspective, if you don't have past performance, it's a neutral rating, right? So it's not a negative rating. So it's not going to hurt you, but it's also not going to help you, right? So against the competition that has past performance, your neutral isn't going to be graded as high as your competition, but it's not going to negatively hurt your proposal. Chris, is that an accurate representation of that, or do you have any further follow-up to that?
Yes, that's a good clarification. It is a neutral rating. So yes, if past performance comes down to the deciding factor and one has, excellent past performance and you have a neutral, it may determine it, but it will not hurt you as in a negative way. As a rating. So that's kind of a convoluted way to say that. But yes, it's a neutral rating. Yes, it's based on the RFO. It's in the FAR. It was not taken out in the revolutionary FAR overhaul. And then I will say, I wasn't sure if this was part of the question, but the past performance can be different depending on the contract you're going for. So if you've already had a contract performance under another one, but it's not relevant or recent, it may not be included. So you may still get that neutral rating if it's not relevant or recent to the current contract that's being solicited.
And the other thing that I'd throw in there, and this was a regulatory update, I think in the 20s or mid 20s, maybe, might have been sooner. Chris, you might know this off the top of your head. I don't know. Any prime contract that has a small business subcontracting plan, so generally not set aside, requires the prime to provide a past performance reference to their small business subcontractors, right? So I think to the extent that small businesses often have a difficult time because it's the chicken and the egg, right? It's like, well, what's your past performance for doing a prime contract? Well, I don't have one. Well, you can't get a prime contract unless you have some past performance. Sort of the chicken and the egg. And the regulatory update was sort of pushed through or encouraged by the Small Business Administration to at least allow, subcontractors to get some past performance references from their primes. And so the regulations require, if the requirement isn't set aside, in other words, if there was a small business subcontracting plan for the prime contractor, that a past performance be provided. Any thoughts, question? And then the JVs, if you're in a JV, you can use potentially the past performance from the JV for each of the members of the JV. Any thoughts on that? Because I think that certainly allows sort of small businesses to get some sort of past performance that might be used in some proposals moving forward, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's correct. Your performance on any subcontracts can be utilized as a past performance element in solicitations and proposals.
Awesome. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this is something that we talked about. And look, so from my perspective on the government contracting side, when we were a small business, this oftentimes, and at that time, and I'm dating myself, right? So like the 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't quick pay, right? And there wasn't as much emphasis on small business funding and small business concerns. And so going from contract award to the first payment and the commitments and responsibilities that you have made it kind of difficult, right? And small businesses have always had a challenge with respect to either self-funding, which becomes difficult, or finding adequate funding that supports government contractors. But we talked about a little bit about this, but that time frame, Chris, sometimes can be like 90 days or more before a small, depending on the structure of the contract, can be 90 days or more before a small business contractor can see even the first payment. So what are your thoughts about, so two things, I guess I would want your thoughts around is, what do you look at in a contract, and you sort of pointed to this, like when you're looking at the solicitation, take a look at, is there mobilization payment? What is the payment structures? What are the payment triggers? So what are the things you look at to see, okay, what do I have to get myself ready for? And then what are some of the things like quick pay or some of the things that you talked about, especially at the Marine Corps, that the government was doing to maybe help small business government contractors?
Yeah, I would say a couple places to look in the solicitation. You're going to have your payment terms. Net 30 is pretty standard. Although you could ask for net 15. I know with small businesses there is a push to have quicker payment. So net 15 is not uncommon, especially if it's a small business set aside or anything like that. Within usually section G, there's administrative data, and that's going to tell you how you invoice. And the process of invoicing. So a lot of times it's through WAF, wide area workflow application. And so that's where you're going to submit, how you submit, what needs to be included in the invoice. So that's all pertinent information just when you go to invoice, so that you don't have rejections and delays in the invoicing process. The other thing is just kind of right off the top, if you look at the CLIN structure and whether there's a delivery date on it or performance date, that's going to kind of tell you when does this need to be performed by and when can I get paid. So if it's a firm fixed price, CLIN 1, let's say, and it's a 2-month deliverable, you can submit that invoice at that 2-month mark and get paid, within the 30, 60 days usually. And so that's just kind of a overall viewpoint of when your first payment might be. Again, progress payments can also be implemented. And payment structure and schedules and different things like that that can be utilized. So those kind of things are just to look out for in these solicitations. What do you need to do to get paid, and what is the potential structure for payment?
Yeah, and I think one thing that especially small businesses face and don't recognize, we talked about making sure you know what delivery is so that you and the government agree on the delivery and then can get paid for it, right? But what you focused on now is not just, okay, you agree that this is success, right? But you have to also understand, because we've seen this a number of times, especially for small businesses, understand the invoicing process and what does a invoice need to look like for the government to accept, right? What system do you go through? What format do they want? What exactly do they want to be able to make a payment against your invoice? And a lot of times, not only do you have a problem on the first part, but you have a problem on the second part too. And quite frankly, a lot of small businesses will throw it over the fence, not follow up. Well, they haven't necessarily followed the format, or there's something missing, or they didn't answer all the questions, and they sit on it and sit on it and sit on it. And the government's like, well, wait, I don't have the proper information to be able to process this payment. So it just gets longer in the term period that the contractor is not seeing payment.
Yes, I agree. And the FAR has what they call a proper invoice, which then runs into the Prompt Payment Act on submission of a proper invoice. So there are requirements on what is included, what needs to be supported, and what needs to be submitted to the government for the process of payment to even begin. And so that's very important to pay attention to. The solicitation, like I said, will have details regarding that. So not only like you mentioned, just performance aspect and successful performance, but actually just the process of submitting payment and to get paid. And there can be some errors through the invoice process that unduly delays that payment that we want to try to avoid.
Yeah, and one other thing on this slide, and I want to see if there's any questions in a second, and then there's a couple of things I just wanted to touch on that we might have missed. But one other thing on this side is for contractors to be aware of: certain contracts withhold or retain part of your payment as you go on until the final deliverable is in place, right? Sometimes, a lot of times around construction, or maybe even systems development or something like that, because there might be trigger payments, but there's a retainage on final delivery. And so That again would be in the solicitation. You would want to be aware of that, and then you would want to account for that during the life cycle of your contract. Right? I mean, and how common is that? What circumstances does that happen in? How often does that happen?
So it's usually in construction type contracts, just to have that, that a little bit of an incentive for completion of the project. It's up to 10% retention is what the threshold is that's regulated. So that can be withheld. If performance is not going well, they can retain, or they can just retain from the get-go as an incentive. So there's different ways they can process that retention, but all of that should be delineated in that solicitation in the contract. It shouldn't be a surprise that it's not included. I have seen and this is just going to the CLIN structure, in like firm fixed price contracts, where there's different deliverables, and then they have a final payment at the end. It's kind of linked to a final deliverable, but it's more just to kind of space out that payment for some small businesses. So that those tend to happen on cash flow kind of contracts, where the government's a little bit more amenable to providing more money up front in a firm fixed price kind of CLIN structure. But then you hold it off at the end just for completion assurance.
Yep. And I think that just makes your point again, Chris, just being aware of all these specificities going in, eyes wide open, because you have to plan for them, right? It shouldn't, to your point, it shouldn't be a surprise. I think in this context, organizations like ELINT can help with contract mobilization, contract funding, et cetera. But even in those instances, going eyes wide open in order to plan it all out from project implementation, award to final delivery and payment, and making sure you've thought about what kind of resources you need to be cash solvent throughout the entire contract process. Let me check and see if there's any questions. I think this was sort of the last substantial slide, but let me first check and see if there's questions. There's two things that came up that I just wanted to touch base on before we move on. But any questions, Madison?
The only question that came in was around retainage and if it shows up in any other places other than contracts. And I think you guys answered that, or other than construction. And I think that you guys answered that pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, have you seen it in systems delivery? I'm trying to think, because I was responsible for like a system at the SBA, and I thought there was like a 10% retainage, but I don't know that for sure. But I think you're right; it's mostly construction.
Yeah, so construction's the only one that has it regulated. So you can do retention in other types of contracts, but that'll be delineated, and it's not like a standardized clause or anything like that. So it's kind of unique language to that maybe specific requirement. And I'd assume 10% would be used just because that's used in the contract or in the construction side for regulation, and the government tends to lean on those, even if they are applying them to other areas.
Awesome. So I think maybe go to the next slide. Yeah, so I think this is sort of your checklist, and I think this is obviously sort of what we've talked about today. Two things that sort of came up to me that are important, and I'm wondering what your perspective is, Chris. And we talked about one of them slightly, and one of them not so much. But one of the things that we saw that created a significant level of risk was a result of price increases and inflation as a result of COVID, and how, if you were in a firm's fixed price, the challenges that raised, and the government in that instance, I think, was trying to create some flexibility as a result of COVID and price increases. So one is, what did that look like during COVID, and did you have a perspective on that? And then the other question is questions, which you and I talked about before, right? You have an opportunity as a contractor. There is a Q&A period. You should take advantage of that. And we've talked about all sorts of things that might need clarity, or even questions that, because contracting officers are just people as well, right? So there might be something that when you ask a question, it actually lights the light bulb in their head, and they're like, oh yeah, that should be more clear. And so they do answer positively to questions sometimes that shed light on issues that they might have not thought about. But those two issues, and I know they're distinct issues. One is sort of the COVID issue and pricing and the inflation, and what was your experience in that? And then just why is it a good idea to engage during the Q&A process?
Yeah, so just to tackle the first one, during COVID, because of the unprecedentedness with the supply chain risks, it affected almost every contract. Anything that went longer than a few months or even towards that year and future years. So a lot of the contracts that we issued were affected by that. We understood that, hey, these supply chain, the costs were increasing. The agencies, the government understood that. We tried to work with contractors as well as possible, to modify contracts, increase pricing, add additional progress payments, different things like that allowed solvency. Because government doesn't want the contracts to fail. They're going through this 12 to 18-month acquisition process to award a contract. Put it on award for the program. It's a need that the program needs. So they want it to be successful, and they want the contractor to be successful so that they can do future contracts. So that was a very unique time. I will say that's not necessarily something that may go forward. So if you don't price in inflation, that's not something that, oh, well, you did it during COVID. That was a very unique time frame. So that's not something to lean back on moving forward. But it just gives you the very stark, drastic example of, hey, future costs rising can hurt current performance, and even then. And then for the Q&A side, yes, I would say that this is take advantage of this time, because during the solicitation time, once the solicitation gets released, there's not a whole lot of communication between industry and the government, especially from the program or technical side. That question time frame is the best time to get answers, to get clarity, to have that communication, because you might kind of get radio silence other than that. So take advantage of that time. You should be able to get answers to the questions you need so that you can, one, submit proposals better and for better award, and also just performance for your award if your proposal is selected.
Yep, thank you. I think that's the slides. Madison, any questions, outstanding questions?
Let's see. What is one habit that you'd tell a contractor to build starting with their very next solicitation?
What is one habit that contractors should build? I think the most important, at least from my perspective, both in and outside government, in addition to sort of the things that we've talked about today, is, I guess, two parts. The go, no-go decision, right? Is there more than a 50 or 60% chance that I'm going to win this? And then the gap analysis, like where are the gaps and how do I strengthen my team to be able to win this opportunity? Oftentimes, conducting that gap analysis and building out the appropriate team, especially as requirements have gotten more complex and larger. And I think we're going to, we haven't even talked about, Chris, I mean, not relevant to this discussion that we had today, but the size standards, like all the requirements are getting larger, your competition is getting larger. So you have to be able to build a team. And so doing that gap analysis to determine how you build a strong team to go after a requirement is critical. The go, no go is critical. Obviously, I think the things we talked about today as far as risks, understanding the statement of work, understanding the solicitation, to Chris's point, sort of the evaluation criteria, what is highly ranked as an evaluation criteria and what's not as highly ranked. If price isn't on top, maybe you're more flexible with your pricing. That wasn't one thing, that was many things, but Chris, any thoughts about sort of what to focus on if there's one or two or three things you should?
Yeah, just to reiterate, L&M, section L&M of a solicitation are wildly important. I know that wasn't a huge topic of conversation today, but that's your instructions and your evaluation criteria. So section L is going to tell you how to submit, what your format needs to be submitting, how much page length, formatting, font, all that stuff. And to be completely honest, if 10 people submit and the government goes through that and you didn't follow those instructions correctly on L, they'll kick you out right then and there because they can. So it's very important to follow. And then after that, looking at the CLIN, PWS, and just coming up with any questions and taking advantage of that Q&A. I would say take advantage of what you can with the Q&A section. Don't let that go just because you think, I'll get to it later, or these aren't that big of a deal. So
And I guess there's two things I'd say. One is folks like Chris from our team can be instrumental in framing the Q&A for contracting officers because he's been on this other side of the fence, right? So it's not just asking the question, it's how you're asking the question to get a response. And folks with the background of contracting can frame the question in a way that allows and nudges the contracting officer to give a response that clarifies. Sometimes you have to reference a reg. Sometimes you have to reference a federal acquisition regulation or a CFR small business regulation or a statutory provision to just nudge them along. And then the other thing that I'd say is planning it out. And we talked about this, right? From mobilization, from award to delivery, and then planning it out successfully with eyes wide open to say, what are my cash flow needs during the life of this? And who do I go to? Do I go to an ELINT Capital? Do I go to others? Do I go to my own bank? What kind of financing is available to make sure that I have positive cash flow and I'm able to go from start to finish on this contract? Any other questions, Madison?
That's it. So that's it for today. I'm so grateful that you two were able to be our guest speakers today. If you want to learn more as an audience member, you are welcome to contact us at info@elintcapital.com. You can call our phone number, you can reach us on our website, and we can also get you connected with John and Chris if you have any other questions for them as well. And next week, we have part 2 where we have another GCP alum. Trevor Skelly is going to be our guest, and he will be going over bidding to win and to execute, how to price the mobilization gap you just learned to spot without pricing yourself out of the competition. So join us for that webinar as well. That will be in 2 weeks from today, same time, 9 a.m. Pacific or noon Eastern. Thank you, John. Thank you, Chris. I hope you guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Take care.